The winter of 1887 came down on the settlement of Prospect Creek like a hammer on cold iron. It was a place carved from the unforgiving northern wilderness, a small collection of cabins huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent expanse of pine and rock. The cold here was not merely a season. It was an adversary, a living entity that probed for weakness. It did not knock before it entered. It seeped through log walls, crept up from the floorboards, and descended from the ceilings, a constant, draining presence that stole heat, strength, and hope. The central struggle for the people of Prospect Creek was not just against the winter, but against the ground itself. The land was a trickster. In the summer, it was a thin layer of soil and muskeg over a heart of permanent ice. In the winter, it froze solid, expanding and gripping everything in its iron fist. But the true enemy was the spring. The thaw was a slow, violent catastrophe. The frozen ground would heave and shift, a great beast stirring in its sleep. It broke the spines of cabins, twisted foundations, and turned sturdy homes into crooked, unlivable wrecks. Every family knew the ritual of failure. They dug their foundations deep, as tradition dictated, sinking posts below the frost line. They believed that by anchoring themselves to the stable earth far below, they could defy the movement of the surface. Yet every spring proved them wrong. The frost would grip their deep-set posts and lift them, or the thawing ground would lose its purchase, causing them to sink. Doors would jam in their frames, windows would crack, and floors would slope at dizzying angles. The settlement was a graveyard of good intentions, littered with the tilted skeletons of cabins abandoned after only a few seasons. They burned through wood at an astonishing rate, their cabins little more than sieves for heat. The iron stoves glowed red day and night, yet a few feet away, a cup of water could freeze solid on a table. Children were kept bundled in layers of wool and fur indoors, their breaths pluming in the air of their own homes. The men would spend their days felling trees, their axes ringing in the brittle air, a constant, desperate battle to feed the insatiable hunger of the stoves. It was a universal problem, a shared hardship that bound them together in a cycle of building, fighting the cold, enduring the thaw, and then repairing or rebuilding once more. They accepted it as the price of living in such a harsh land. It was the way things were done, because it was the only way they knew. Into this world of grim tradition came Elara. She was a widow, having lost her husband Arthur to a fever on the journey north. She arrived not with the loud confidence of a seasoned frontiersman, but with a quiet, observant stillness that the others mistook for fragility. She had two small children, a boy named Tom and a girl named Lena, whose wide, watchful eyes mirrored their mother's. They were seen as vulnerable, a family unit ill-equipped for the brutalities of this life. The community offered pity, which was meant as kindness, but it carried the heavy weight of low expectations. What they did not see was the source of Elara's quiet strength. Arthur had been an engineer, a man fascinated not by conquering nature, but by understanding its rhythms. He had spent years studying the unique challenges of building in the far north, filling a thick, leather-bound journal with diagrams, calculations, and theories. He had read accounts from Russian builders in Siberia, and studied the ancient practices of the native peoples who had lived on this land for centuries. His journal was Elara's inheritance, a legacy of knowledge that she carried with her like a sacred text. When it came time for her to build her cabin before the first snows, the settlement's most respected builder, a broad-shouldered man named Silas, came to offer his guidance. He was a man of practical experience, his hands calloused from a lifetime of wielding an axe and adze. He believed in what he could see and touch, in the proven methods passed down through generations. "You'll need to dig your posts deep," he said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "At least 6 feet. Get below the heave. It's the only way to have a chance." He pointed to a spot he had chosen for her, a flat piece of ground near the edge of the settlement. Ilara listened patiently, her hands clasped in front of her. When he was finished, she looked at the ground, then back at him, and spoke in a voice that was soft but clear. "Thank you, Silas, but I will not be digging a foundation." Silas blinked. He thought he had misheard. "What was that?" "I will not use foundation posts," she repeated. "I will build on the surface." A slow smile spread across Silas's face, a smile of disbelief and amusement. He looked around at the other men who had gathered to watch. "On the surface? Woman, the thaw will pick your cabin up and toss it into the creek. A house must have roots. It must be anchored." "Some things are stronger when they are not anchored," Ilara replied, her gaze unwavering. She held up Arthur's journal, though she did not open it. "My husband studied this. The ground moves. Fighting it is the mistake. The answer is to move with it." Her idea, when it was explained, seemed like madness to them. She planned to clear the top layer of insulating muskeg and soil, and then lay down a thick, wide pad of screened gravel. Her cabin would not be attached to the earth at all. It would simply rest upon this bed of stones, a raft on a shifting sea. The laughter started then. It wasn't cruel, not at first. It was the condescending laughter of experienced men, confronted with what they saw as the naive fantasy of an outsider, a woman who knew nothing of their world. "A house on pebbles," one man scoffed. "The first winter wind will blow it over." "She's building a house of cards," another added, shaking his head. "It's a shame, a waste of good timber." Silas held up a hand, his amusement turning to a more serious concern. "Ilara, this is foolishness, and dangerous. You have children to think of. Let us build it for you, the proper way. We will not charge for the labor." It was a genuine offer, born of a sense of duty to protect the weakest members of the flock. But Ilara shook her head. "I will build it my way," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "The danger is in fighting the ground, not in respecting it." Her refusal solidified their opinion of her. She was not just naive, she was stubborn. The pity they had felt for her curdled into frustration and mockery. They called her cabin Ilara's Folly before the first log was even laid. They watched her from a distance, shaking their heads as she began her strange, solitary work. She was an outcast by choice, a dreamer building a house on a foundation of foolish ideas. The community turned its back, convinced they would be picking up the pieces of her mistake come springtime. And so, Ilara began her work alone. The sun was already beginning its long, slow retreat toward the southern horizon, and the air held a crisp, warning bite. She knew she had little time. While the other men in the settlement worked in teams, their voices and the rhythmic thud of their axes echoing through the forest, Ilara's labor was a quiet, solitary affair. Her children, too young to help with the heavy lifting, played nearby, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim silence of the surrounding wilderness. Her first task was not to build up, but to dig down. However, she did not dig the deep, narrow holes for posts that Silas had advised. Instead, she began to meticulously scrape away the surface of the land. She used a spade and a wheelbarrow, removing the thick, spongy layer of muskeg and topsoil. It was grueling, back-breaking work. This organic layer, she knew from Arthur's notes, acted like a thick blanket, insulating the permafrost below. Leaving it in place would cause a thermal imbalance once the cabin was built, leading to unpredictable thawing and heaving. The men watched her, perplexed. She was digging, yes, but she was digging everything. Once she had cleared a wide rectangle down to the hard-packed mineral soil, her real work began. She took the wheelbarrow and a shovel to the banks of the creek, where millennia of flowing water had deposited vast quantities of rounded stones and gravel. She needed not just any stone, but clean, well-draining gravel. She built a simple screen from wire mesh and a wooden frame, and began the painstaking process of sifting. She shoveled the raw creek bed material onto the screen, shaking it back and forth. The fine sand and silt fell through, leaving only the clean, sorted stones behind. Day after day, she followed this rhythm. Shovel, sift, load the wheelbarrow, push it up the slight incline to her building site, dump the gravel, return to the creek. The men building a new cabin for a recently arrived family on the other side of the settlement worked with loud efficiency. Their saws sang, their hammers rang out, and their structure rose quickly on its deep-set posts. They would pause in their work, wipe the sweat from their brows, and watch Ilara in her slow, repetitive toil. They saw a woman moving pebbles, and they shook their heads at the futility of it all. But Ilara was not just moving pebbles. She was creating a foundation of principle. Arthur's journal had explained it with precise clarity. The thick gravel pad would do two things. First, it would allow any water to drain away instantly, preventing the formation of ice lenses that could tear a foundation apart. Second, and most importantly, it would act as a thermal break. It would keep the warmth of the cabin from penetrating deep into the ground and thawing the permafrost. The house would essentially float on a stable, dry island of its own making. She spread the gravel meticulously, one wheelbarrow at a time, tamping it down with a heavy log. She used a long, straight plank and a spirit level to ensure the pad was perfectly flat. Her precision was absolute. While the other builders relied on brute force and the hope that their deep posts would hold, Ilara relied on physics. Her children would sometimes help, carrying a single, perfect stone in their small hands and placing it carefully on the growing gray rectangle. They did not understand the science, but they understood their mother's determination. By the time her gravel pad was complete, a full foot thick and extending several feet beyond the planned footprint of her cabin, the other new cabin was already walled and roofed. Silas and his crew were celebrated for their speed and efficiency. They had finished their work in a fraction of the time, their structure standing tall and proud, a testament to the traditional way. Ilara had spent weeks just preparing the ground. Only then did she begin to lay the logs. She had traded what little money she had for a pile of milled logs, and she worked with a calm focus that unnerved those who watched. Every notch was cut with care, every joint sealed perfectly. Her cabin was small and simple, but it was built with the precision of a master craftsman. She did not rush. She did not cut corners. As she worked, the whispers continued. "The logs are good. It's a shame they're sitting on a pile of rocks. When the ground shifts, it'll just slide apart." The first snow fell as she was fitting the final roof beams. It was a light dusting, a gentle harbinger of the fury to come. She worked faster then, her movements economical and sure. She sealed the roof and chinked the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, her hands raw and aching in the rapidly dropping temperatures. The day she moved her children inside, the mockery had faded, replaced by a kind of morbid curiosity. Everyone in Prospect Creek was now simply waiting for the spring, waiting for the inevitable, spectacular failure of Ilara's folly. They were not waiting out of malice, but out of the certainty of their own hard-won experience. In this land, the ground always won. And Ilara had built her house on nothing at all. The great storm arrived not with a sudden onslaught, but with a quiet, menacing stealth. It began as a deepening of the cold, a stillness in the air that felt heavy and ancient. The sky turned a flat, metallic gray, and the sun became a pale, distant wafer of light. Then, the wind began to blow. It was not a gusting wind, but a steady, relentless river of Arctic air that flowed down from the north, carrying with it a fine, stinging snow that seemed to cut like powdered glass. The winter of 1888, as it would later be called, was not just a season of hardship. It was a siege. The temperature plummeted to levels that even the oldest residents had never witnessed. The trees in the forest groaned and cracked in the cold, their frozen sap expanding with explosive force. The air itself felt thin and brittle. For the people of Prospect Creek, life shrank to the confines of their cabins, a constant battle for warmth. The stacks of firewood they had thought would be plentiful for the winter dwindled at an alarming rate. Inside the traditional cabins, the cold was a palpable enemy. Frost coated the interior walls, tracing the gaps between the logs with delicate, cruel patterns of ice. The floors were so cold that they felt damp, and drafts cut through the rooms like knives. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them logs every hour, yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the iron surface. Silas, in his own well-built cabin, found his stockpile of wood shrinking faster than ever before. His walls, anchored deep in the frozen earth, conducted the profound cold upwards. The ground, frozen solid to a depth of 10 feet, was a heat sink, pulling the warmth from his home. He had to chop more wood, then more again, his days consumed by the unending task of feeding the fire. Other families fared worse. The Green family ran out of dry firewood in February and had to start burning green, unseasoned logs, which hissed and smoked and gave off precious little heat. Their youngest child developed a persistent, rattling cough. In another cabin, a foundation post, gripped by the expanding frost, heaved upwards with such force that it cracked the main floor joist with a sound like a pistol shot in the dead of night. The floor now slanted at a precarious angle, and the family lived in fear of a total collapse. The settlement was suffering, its proven methods failing under the strain of an extraordinary winter. Meanwhile, in Alara's cabin, a different story was unfolding. The small structure, sitting isolated on its bed of gravel, faced the same brutal wind, the same suffocating cold. But inside, there was a strange, quiet calm. The gravel pad was working exactly as Arthur's journal had predicted. The thick layer of stone acted as an insulator, preventing the cabin's modest warmth from being sucked into the frozen abyss of the permafrost below. The heat from her small, efficient stove did not vanish into the ground. It rose, circulated, and was held within the tightly chinked walls. Her cabin was not warm by the standards of a softer world, but it was comfortable. There was no frost on her interior walls. The floor, separated from the frozen earth by the gravel, was cool but not icy. She consumed firewood at less than half the rate of her neighbors. While they spent their days in a frantic cycle of chopping and stoking, Alara had time to mend her children's clothes, to teach them their letters, and to read from Arthur's books. Her home was an island of stability in a sea of cold. The wind howled outside, and the snow piled in deep drifts against the walls, but inside, life continued with a gentle, steady rhythm. Her foundation of loose stones held no anchor to the deep cold, and in that freedom, it found its strength. The community, isolated in their own shivering homes, remained oblivious. They were all just waiting for the thaw, the true test, when the foolish woman's house on pebbles would surely be destroyed. The thaw began with a sound. It was the soft, persistent dripping of water from the eaves, a sound no one in Prospect Creek had heard for 5 long months. The sun, which had been a stranger, returned with a sudden, surprising warmth. The metallic gray sky softened to a pale blue, and the iron grip of the frost began to loosen. For a day, there was a sense of collective relief, a shared joy that the long siege was over. But the veterans of this land knew better. The thaw was not a reprieve, it was the second act of the tragedy. The ground, frozen to an unprecedented depth, began to soften from the top down. The vast accumulation of snow melted into a deluge of water that had nowhere to go. The thin layer of soil became a soupy, unstable morass. The settlement of Prospect Creek turned into a landscape of mud and slush. And then the heaving began. The deep, trapped ice below the surface started to move, shifting the earth with irresistible force. The sounds started in the night. A low groaning from the earth, the sharp crack of wood under immense pressure, the tinkle of breaking glass. In Silas's cabin, he was awoken by a violent shudder that ran through the entire structure. He tried to open his front door, but it was jammed tight in its frame, the house having twisted on its foundation. A long, jagged crack appeared in the wall above the hearth. In the Green family's home, the post that had cracked their joist in the winter now sank into the soft ground, causing one corner of their cabin to drop by nearly a foot. Dishes slid from shelves and shattered on the tilted floor. Throughout the settlement, it was the same story of chaos and destruction. Cabins that had stood for years were now broken and deformed. The deep posts they had put their faith in had become instruments of their own ruin, acting as levers for the shifting frost to tear their homes apart. The community's collective wisdom lay in shambles, a testament to a battle against nature that had once again been lost. Desperation set in as families tried to shore up their tilting homes, their faces grim with the knowledge of the immense work and cost that lay ahead. Amidst this chaos, one structure remained untouched. Ilara's cabin sat serenely on its gravel pad, perfectly level, perfectly square. The meltwater drained away through the stones, leaving the ground around her home damp but not flooded. The great heaving of the earth beneath it caused the entire cabin to shift slightly, to rise and fall as a single, solid unit, like a boat on a gentle swell. It did not fight the movement, it rode with it. Inside, nothing was disturbed. A cup of water on the table was still. A marble placed on the floor would not roll. Ilara and her children watched the chaos unfolding around them from their window, their small home an ark of tranquility in a flood of failure. Silas was the first to see it. After finally prying his own door open with a crowbar, he stood outside, surveying the damage to his home, his heart heavy with frustration and defeat. His gaze drifted across the muddy field to the edge of the settlement, to the place where Ilara's folly stood. He expected to see a pile of collapsed logs, a ruin that would confirm everything he had believed. Instead, he saw a perfect, undisturbed cabin, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. He could not believe it. It had to be a trick of the light, an illusion. Wiping the mud from his boots, he began the slow walk across the sodden ground. As he got closer, the reality of it settled in. The cabin was pristine. The lines were straight. The roof was level. The door sat perfectly square in its frame. He walked around the entire structure, his eyes fixed on the base. He saw how the log walls sat upon the clean, gray bed of gravel, unattached, unbound, and utterly stable. He bent down and touched the stones. They were cool and dry. He saw no cracks in the chinking, no strain on the joints. It was impossible. It defied a lifetime of experience. He hesitated for a moment, his pride a bitter taste in his mouth. Then he knocked on the door. It swung open smoothly, without a hint of sticking. Ilara stood there, her expression calm, holding a cup of tea. She did not look surprised to see him. Behind her, he could see her children playing quietly on the floor. The air inside was warm and still. "Silas," she said, her voice even. He was speechless for a moment, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be true. He looked past her, at the level floor, the straight walls, the simple, peaceful order of the room. It was a sanctuary. He finally found his voice, which came out as a hoarse whisper. "How?" Ilara did not smile in triumph. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply stepped aside. "Would you like some tea?" she offered. He stepped inside, and the contrast was staggering. He had just come from his own home, a place of chaos and ruin, with a floor that felt like the deck of a sinking ship. Here, the floor was as solid and level as the day it was laid. The warmth was gentle and even, a world away from the scorching, then freezing zones around his own stove. He looked at the window, and the glass was intact. He saw a small wooden top that Tom had been playing with lying still on the floorboards. In his own house, it would have immediately rolled into the corner that had sunk. Ilara handed him a steaming mug. Her movements were unhurried, her demeanor one of profound peace. She had not merely built a shelter, she had created a place of harmony in a land defined by its violence. She had won. But there was no gloating in her victory, no arrogance. Her quiet triumph was in the simple, undeniable fact that her home worked. It was in the steady floor beneath his feet, the warm air on his face, and the undisturbed peace of her children. Silas sank onto a small wooden stool, the warmth of the mug seeping into his cold, calloused hands. He was the most respected builder in Prospect Creek, a man whose knowledge was sought and whose word was law when it came to construction. And he had been wrong. Utterly, fundamentally wrong. His deep anchors had failed, while her floating raft had succeeded. He looked at this quiet woman, whom he had pitied and mocked, and saw not a fool, but a visionary. Her humility in this moment was more powerful than any rebuke. She simply let the evidence speak for itself. It was a lesson taught not with words, but with the silent, unshakable truth of a level floor. Word of Silas's visit spread through the settlement like a grass fire. It was one thing to see Ilara's cabin standing from a distance, but it was another entirely to hear from the most skeptical man among them that it was, in fact, perfect. Soon, a small, hesitant procession of people made their way across the muddy ground to see for themselves. They came in ones and twos, their faces a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and dawning respect. They walked around the small cabin, just as Silas had done, their eyes tracing the clean lines and the strange gravel foundation. They peered at the base, some even kneeling to touch the stones, as if trying to divine their secret. The laughter and mockery of the previous fall were gone, replaced by a hushed awe. The cabin, once derided as Ilara's folly, was now being called the miracle. It stood as a silent rebuke to their own broken homes and their own stubborn pride. Ilara received them all with the same quiet grace. She opened her door and let them see the level floor, the straight walls, the calm interior. She answered their questions simply and directly, without a trace of superiority. She explained how the gravel pad allowed the house to move with the ground, rather than fighting against it. She talked about drainage and the importance of insulating the permafrost. She was not lecturing them, she was simply sharing what she knew. A few days later, Silas returned. He did not come empty-handed. In one hand, he held a carpenter's pencil, and in the other, a small, blank notebook. His face was stripped of its former arrogance, his expression now one of earnest humility. He stood before Ilara, a student before a master. "Teach me," he said, the words simple and direct. It was an apology, a concession, and a plea all in one. It was the moment the entire community's perspective shifted, crystallized in the request of its proudest member. Ilara did not hesitate. She invited him inside and cleared the small kitchen table. She did not begin with her own words, but instead brought out Arthur's leather-bound journal. She laid it open on the table, its pages filled with his neat, precise handwriting, detailed diagrams, and complex calculations. "It was my husband, Arthur," she explained softly. "He was an engineer. He believed that you could not force the land to do what you want. You had to listen to it and learn its rules." For hours, she and Silas sat at that table. She guided him through Arthur's research. She showed him the drawings of the gravel pad, the cross-sections illustrating how the permafrost remained undisturbed, the notes on the physics of thermal transfer. She explained why digging deep posts in this kind of ground was not only useless but counterproductive, as it created a direct thermal bridge that caused the very thawing and heaving they were trying to prevent. Silas listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. He asked sharp, intelligent questions, his builder's mind quickly grasping the practical implications of the theory. He made careful notes in his book, sketching his own versions of Arthur's diagrams. The complex science was being translated into practical, applicable knowledge. He was not just learning a new technique. He was learning an entirely new way of thinking about building, about the land, and about the nature of strength. He learned that true strength was not in rigid resistance, but in flexible adaptation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the muddy settlement, Silas finally closed his notebook. He looked at Ilara, his eyes filled with a profound respect. "All this time," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we were fighting the wrong enemy. We thought it was the Thaw, but it was our own ignorance." Ilara simply nodded. She had not sought credit or praise. Her only goal had been to build a safe home for her children. In doing so, she had provided a new future for the entire community. The knowledge was shared freely, a gift from a man who had dreamed of this place, and a woman who had the courage to see his vision through. The following spring, a new sound filled the air in Prospect Creek. It was not the familiar sound of augers boring deep into the earth. It was the scrape and rattle of shovels on stone, the rhythmic thud of tampers, and the grating noise of wire screens sifting gravel. The season of repair became a season of rebirth. Led by Silas, the community began to rebuild, but this time they did it Ilara's way. They did not try to repair their broken foundations. Instead, they carefully jacked up their cabins, one by one, and sawed off the deep, useless posts. They cleared the ground beneath their homes, scraping away the muskeg and laying down the same kind of thick, level gravel pads that Ilara had pioneered. Silas, once the chief skeptic, was now the most dedicated teacher, moving from site to site with his notebook, patiently explaining the principles to his neighbors, ensuring that every pad was laid with the same precision as the first. The landscape of the settlement physically changed. The crooked, tilting cabins were straightened, resettled on their new, stable beds of stone. That summer, 3 new families arrived, and their cabins were built from the start on gravel foundations. The method was no longer called Ilara's Folly. It was simply called the Prospect Creek Foundation. It became the new tradition, a piece of collective wisdom born from a profound lesson in humility. The community, once bound by a shared cycle of failure, was now united in a new era of stability and success. The story of the floating cabins of Prospect Creek began to travel. A government surveyor, passing through the next year, was astonished to find a settlement where the homes were not being slowly torn apart by the permafrost. He spent a week with Silas and Ilara, filling his own journals with notes and diagrams. He took the story with him to other northern outposts, to mining camps and trading posts that were all facing the same desperate struggle against the land. The idea spread, a quiet revolution carried by word of mouth and by the simple, undeniable evidence of its success. It was a solution born not in a government office or a university laboratory, but from the careful observation of a thoughtful engineer and the quiet courage of a widow who trusted his knowledge more than the loud certainty of the crowd. Years later, when Alada was an old woman and her children had children of their own, she would often sit on her porch and watch the town. It was a larger, more prosperous place now, but every single structure, from the largest trading post to the smallest home, rested on a bed of gravel. Her own cabin, the first of its kind, was still perfectly level, its logs weathered to a silver gray, a quiet monument to a pivotal moment in the town's history. She never sought recognition, and she never boasted about her role. She didn't have to. The proof was all around her. The ultimate lesson of Prospect Creek was not about construction. It was a story about the nature of wisdom. It taught that the deepest foundations are not always made of earth and stone, but of humility, observation, and the courage to question the way things have always been done. It was a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the quietest voices, and that true strength is found not in fighting the world, but in learning how to move with it.